Welcome back to our mini lectures on World War One. This particular mini lecture is actually a continuation of our overview of 1915, and in particular some of the battles that were taking place on the Western Front in 1915. So we've already looked at the French attack in Champagne at the very beginning of the year. We have looked at the British offensive at Neuve-Chapelle, and we've looked at that overlapping German offensive in Ypres, the Second Battle of Ypres. So we're now moving on to May 1915, and I want to start by looking at the French offensive in the area of Vimy Ridge. So if we go back to our map, the Vimy Ridge area is around here. Now, I know that's further north than some of the areas I've said the French were protecting in the past, but early in the war, the British had quite a small army, and so we see the French along this area north of the Somme. Certainly that changes as the war progresses, and the British take a much larger area of the line as the war progresses. Their army is built from all the volunteers, and from 1916 conscription certainly builds the size of the British army. But in May 1915, we see a French offensive on the Vimy Ridge. There are British involved in support, and they are, of course, attacking the Germans. It's an attempt to break through what is known as a German strongpoint in this area. And again, the interesting thing for us to note is that while the French are able to make some good gains on the first day, they're not able to hold them. And so what we get are the Germans launching a counterattack just the following day and pushing the French back yet again. As the battle progressed, Germans are able to bring more reserves into the area and strengthen their lines. So we are able to see some French-British gains throughout this battle, but no significant gains were made. As a result, however, we had 100,000 French casualties, 27,000 British casualties, and 75,000 German casualties. And this is just one small battle. Let's move on now to much later in the year. We don't see any major offensives happening on the Western Front during the summer period in 1915. But in September 1915, we're back to now the Battle of Loos. So it's a British attack. It's happening in this area here, in Loos. At the same time, the French are attacking in this area again, in Champagne. So it's a double-headed attack, deliberately designed to try to limit the German defensive positions, stretch the Germans a little bit by this double-headed attack. If we focus on the attack at Loos, the British-led attack at Loos, we have an opening artillery barrage only for about 20 minutes, and that's actually a little bit shorter than what they'd been seeing early as the year had progressed. And so after 20 minutes, when they launched the infantry attack, it actually took the Germans by surprise. One of the other features of this battle is that the British are using chlorine gas, and this particular picture is a photograph showing the British actually moving through the gas cloud that has been released. And you may remember from our previous mini lecture, the way in which they're starting to deliver the gas is from very large cylinders. Still, of course, it is a problem with wind change direction. The British soldiers moving into this gas cloud would, of course, be using the gas masks. It would not have taken them by surprise. The British do have initial success in this battle at Loos and reach the second line of the German trenches. But again, the problem is that they're unable to hold it. The reserves, the equipment are not able to come up and successfully hold the gains that have been made. And certainly there's no breakthrough of the line. In the end, what we are seeing towards the end of 1915 are the Germans have really bolstered their defensive position. As the British attack, the Germans are able to use heavy artillery bombardment in retaliation. They've got better ammunition supplies. Their barbed wire has become thicker as the year has progressed, which means that the British artillery bombardment is unable to break through the wire as was originally planned. And overall, the Germans are just better supplied with things like the mortars, grenades, and trench fighting equipment, and able to hold off defensively with no problem. The battles towards the end of 1915 are very fierce battles, and again we see very high rates of casualty. So if we take a look at our page, we can see here we've got 195 French casualties, 195,000 French casualties, 190,000 British, and 200,000 German casualties in this last few months of 1915. So while we are seeing large numbers of men dying in 1915, we are seeing some new tactics being used, but certainly not being used very effectively. The next thing I want to show you is just an understanding of some of the other things that are happening in World War I during 1915, so you have a bit of an understanding of why the Western Front becomes such an important front and the major place where battles are going to take place in 1916 and 1917. One of the key things that was happening in 1915 in an attempt at, once we get the stalemate happening on the Western Front, both sides are thinking about how they could actually win the war other than via the Western Front. And so an attempt is made in this area of the world. The Ottoman Empire, of course, is fighting on the same side as the Germans and Austro-Hungarians during World War I. You can see these lighter coloured countries, including Bulgaria here, are known as the Central Powers. Because this area of the sea here, very narrow passage of land called the Dardanelles, is the access for Russia to be able to bring equipment, reserves into the Mediterranean Sea. And so it's quite a vital area. And it had been, of course, sea mines put into the sea. And the Turks held this area. And so any Russian ships trying to get through the passageway through the Dardanelles was quite unsuccessful. So there was the attempt to take the Gallipoli Peninsula and hold it. And that one, of course, is quite famous for us in Australia, as it's the first place that we see Australian troops really in action, landing on the 25th of April 1915. And they stayed at the Gallipoli Peninsula until late December, early January 1916, when the British withdrew. So in Gallipoli, while we know about the Australians there, of course there were New Zealanders, British and French troops, all in an attempt to see if they could break through in this particular area to help them win the war. This is a quite famous photograph taken on the day of the landing at Anzac Cove at Gallipoli, so the start of the Anzac campaign in Gallipoli. The most successful part of the Gallipoli campaign, of course, is the evacuation. They don't meet any of their goals. And what that means is that this area becomes problematic and we need to return again to the Western Front as the place where the British are feeling they may be able to make a breakthrough and win the war. In the meantime, we need to understand that it's not just the Western Front here and fighting at Gallipoli that's going on. We've also got the Turks moving into the north and fighting in this direction. We also have the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians fighting on what we call the Eastern Front against Russia. Now the Turks are not particularly successful and are pushed back, and we're going to see a lot more fighting in this area here as the war progresses. On the Eastern Front here as well, the Russians seem to be doing quite well at the beginning, but the Austro-Hungarians call in their friends, the Germans, and the Germans, with their much more efficient tactics, weapons, better trained men, able to support the Austro-Hungarians, and we very quickly see the Russians breaking down and being pushed backwards. So I've already talked about one battle, for example, where the Germans had to take reserves from the Western Front, push them across to the east in order to help their friends, the Austro-Hungarians. But as time goes on and this area becomes more under control of the Central Powers, some of those German troops are able to move back. And it's this movement of troops between the two lines which we really want to keep track of. You don't need to know much about the battles on this side. It is interesting to note, however, that we don't really have trench warfare as much on that side. On the Eastern Front, it is much more a war of movement, difficult to hold positions, and so more fluidity and movement of the line as time goes on. What I want to quickly do now, though, is move through to an understanding of, here's some pictures. This one is the Tsar with his Russian troops. And here we've got some Russian troops dancing. This is a German prisoner of war, and the Russians are teaching him how to dance. We need to come back to the Western Front in particular and understand the lessons that we've learned from 1915. So we have seen the development of this preliminary artillery bombardment. It is made longer, especially once more ammunition becomes available, in order to be more effective. But its effectiveness is impacted by a lack of coordination between artillery and the infantry, and the inability of either side really to bring up sufficient reserves to hold any gains that have been made as a result of the use of artillery bombardment followed by an infantry attack. The German defensive has also improved, and this is a problem for the Allies, of course. Germans have got thicker barbed wire, and the artillery bombardments are not cutting through the barbed wire. So you can imagine the problems therefore for the infantry trying to make their way across no man's land when they've been promised the barbed wire has been broken, but they need to stop and cut it themselves. Also, the Germans understand the effectiveness of the machine gun as a defensive weapon, and we see the numbers of machine guns increasing across the Western Front. This is going to make infantry attacks all more difficult to achieve any significant gains and definitely any breakthrough. We're also seeing during 1915 the introduction of gas. So we've got chlorine gas being used. Its effectiveness is limited because they had poor delivery methods, just releasing gas out of a cylinder, very dependent on wind conditions. And so what they need to do is find new ways to deliver the gas. And what we'll see in 1916 is gas being delivered by shell, so that it can be much more targeted and more effective delivery of the gas to where they want it to be. We've also seen at the same time developing improved protection against gas. Chlorine gas, for example, so long as you've got a mask and goggles on, you can work with chlorine gas. So it's only if you can take the other side by surprise that it could be an effective weapon. This is why we see new gases being introduced after 1915. The other thing we really need to learn from 1915 is that there are very, very high casualties. While we're not focused on any of the particular battles for our syllabus, we need to understand that there are a lot of small battles in 1915, very high rates of casualty for very little gain. And so the strategies and tactics they're trying, we are seeing them develop, but we're certainly not seeing any breakthrough. We're not seeing any break of the stalemate at this stage.